Good afternoon. My name is Mary Marcuccio and I am Vice President of the Dante Ligeri Society in Melbourne. I welcome everyone in Victoria and from many parts of Australia and Italy to this online event. The Dante Ligeri Society of Melbourne was founded 125 years ago. This year, in association with the 11 branches of the Australian societies, we have spent the last year commemorating the life and cultural legacy that Dante Ligeri has bestowed on the world. The title of our conference this year was Under the Southern Cross, which invited members and artists to reflect and express how Dante was influential for them in their own works of art, music, and literature. Born in Florence in the 13th century, Dante Ligeri left one of many works to the world, in particular his famous 3 volumes of the Divine Comedy. These writings in the Florentine vernacular have captured the interest and curiosity of many people all over the world for centuries. Beginning this year on the 25th of March, celebrated as Dante's Day, the Dante Alighieri societies throughout the world have been acknowledging Dante's life and works by holding events across all media and art forms, from music to theatre performances, literary conferences and lectures. And I regret that a number of such lectures have been cancelled here in Melbourne until next year because of the lockdowns in Victoria. Dante Ligeri has inspired writers, musicians, historians and artists to create and express their interpretation of the Divine Comedy in a myriad of ways. In turn, they have brought Dante into the modern world context to new audiences and generations. Today, the Dante Society of Melbourne, in collaboration with the National Gallery of Victoria, has the pleasure to present to you William Blake's watercolour illustrations on the Divine Comedy. Our presenter is Senior Curator Miss Cathy Leahy, who has expert knowledge on the watercolour illustrations in the National Gallery's collection. Cathy will be followed by Dr. Paolo Baracchi, Secretary of the Melbourne Society, who will read in Italian Canto 3 from Inferno, Hell, which inspired Blake to illustrate a number of scenes from Dante's 100 Canticles. To conclude this event, Dr. Dominic Barbaro, the President of the Dante Society, would like to express his closing sentiments. Please make yourselves comfortable in your homes as we enjoy the works of English artist William Blake, introduced by Miss Cathy Leahy. Thank you.
Thanks, Mary. And it's a great pleasure for me to be here today to talk to you about one of the great treasures of the National Gallery of Victoria's collection. These are the 36 watercolours by William Blake that he made in the last years of his life as illustrations to Dante's great epic poem, The Divine Comedy. The NGV has the largest number of works from this series of 102 watercolours that today are divided between 7 museums around the world. Blake's Divine Comedy watercolours are considered to be among the crowning achievements of his long career. In them, the artist's late style and rich watercolour technique give powerful visual form to his penetrating illustrations of Dante's literary masterpiece. William Blake is one of the greatest figures of the Romantic era, an artist and a poet whose work is known for its highly charged metaphorical expression and originality. Imagination was of supreme importance to Blake, who believed that art must proceed from inner visions and not the empirical observation of nature. He made watercolours of great expressive beauty, as well as drawings, prints, tempera paintings, and hand-printed books of prophetic poetry in which he presented his highly personal and apocalyptic mythology. Illustrating texts then, both his own and those of other authors, was a mainstay of his long career. From the late 1780s, Blake began producing small, hand-printed illustrated books of his own poetry that brought together the twin aspects of his genius. These are some of his most original productions, for which he devised a new printing method that enabled him to print the textual and visual elements together from a single plate. Blake's illuminated books, such as the Songs of Innocence of 1789, two leaves of which I'm showing you here, also in the NGV's collection, promoted a unity of text and illustration that was unprecedented in the history of the printed book. When he turned to illustrating other texts, Blake was equally as original, not only in the presentation of the illustrations, but also in his approach to interpreting the text. We see this in his well-known illustration to Edward Young's popular meditative poem, Night Thoughts, that was published in 1797, in which he presented his own personal interpretation and commentary upon Young's poetry through his illustrative cycle. Here, his elucidation of the text was realised through the visualisation of textual allusions and metaphors. In Blake's later series of watercolours, illustrating Milton's poetry, biblical texts such as the Book of Job and Dante's Divine Comedy, we see the artist willing to engage in interpreting the text in light of his own ideas, as we shall soon see. Come now to the Divine Comedy. So Blake's Divine Comedy illustrations were made at the very end of his life and came about through the patronage of the young landscape painter John Linnell. Linnell met Blake in 1818 and introduced the older artist, who had been living in grinding poverty for years, to a wider circle of supporters. He arranged commissions and grants of funds for him, and also commissioned important series of works from the artist for himself, for which he paid him a stipend. The Divine Comedy series was one such commission, and the works remained with the Linnell family throughout the 19th century until they came onto the market in 1918, and that's when they came into the NGV's collection. Linnell commissioned Blake to illustrate Dante's text in 1824. There was no contract, as there had been for earlier commissions, but Linnell probably commissioned 100 works which were to be engraved. We know that Blake had started on the series by October of 1824, for the painter Samuel Palmer has left us a most evocative picture of the artist at work on the Dante designs. He visited Blake together with Linnell and found him sick in bed, but, as he described, hard-working on a bed covered with books, looking like one of the antique patriarchs or a dying Michelangelo, making in the leaves of a great book, folio size, his sublime designs. Blake worked on the series for 3 years, and when he died in August 1827, he left 102 watercolours in varying stages of completion and 7 unfinished engravings. And what I'm showing you here is just a couple of the finished engravings, finished watercolours, an unfinished watercolour, and one of the engravings of one of the watercolours. So by the time Blake embarked on his series, Dante was beginning to be more widely read in English by this time. And so while a number of the sublime and terrible passages of the Inferno had been known in Britain since the later 18th century, the first English translation of the entire Divine Comedy had only been published in 1814 by Henry Carey. This made the work, Dante's text, more widely available and especially appreciated by the Romantic poets who helped promote its growing critical appraisal. Blake himself had long been familiar with Dante's great poem. One of the patrons of his mid-career was the poet and essayist William Hayley, who had translated a section of the Inferno, just a small section, in the 1780s. He commissioned Blake to paint a head of Dante for his library and had given him a copy of Henry Boyd's published version of the Inferno in around 1800, which Blake had annotated. So he'd been engaged with the text since this time. Blake also knew the sets of illustrations to Dante made by his friends, Henry Fuseli, the Swiss artist, and especially John Flaxman's series of 110 engraved illustrations, which were published in 1802. We know that Blake used Carey's translation when he came to producing his own illustrations, and it was also reported by a contemporary who went to visit him, Henry Crabb Robinson, that he had taught himself Italian in order to read the original as well. While Blake responded to Dante's imaginative vision and the power of vivid description, there were aspects of his theology that he took exception to. In particular, he objected to Dante's notion of retributive justice, to his preoccupation with judgment and vengeance. In the Divine Comedy, Dante's hell is a tiered system of punishment and retribution, where different categories of sinners were subjected to differentiated punishments in each of the 9 circles of hell. For Blake, the forgiveness of sin was fundamental to the teachings of Jesus Christ, and therefore for him, forgiveness was the very bedrock of Christianity. On one of the unfinished Divine Comedy drawings, Blake scribbled, and here I'm quoting him, "Whatever book is for vengeance and for sin, and whatever book is against the forgiveness of sin, is not of the Father, but of Satan the accuser and father of hell." Blake also claimed in a reported conversation, "Dante saw devils where I see none, I see only good." However, although he may have been critical of aspects of Dante's belief, it is evident from the images that Blake respected Dante's text, that he read it carefully and faithfully recorded many of its details. And there can be no doubt that Blake was greatly inspired by him. In particular, it was Dante's imaginative description of hell that he particularly responded to. 72 of the watercolours are dedicated to Inferno, while 20 are to Purgatorio and 10 to Paradiso. So this image I'm showing you, Dante running from the 3 beasts, is the first illustration in the series, and it depicts the opening verses of Inferno. So finding himself midway through the life, lost in a dark wood, Dante is assailed by 3 beasts, the leopard, the lion, and the wolf. Fleeing in terror, he encounters the apparition of Virgil, the Roman poet, and begs for his help. You will notice here and throughout the entire series that Dante is dressed in red, a colour that Blake associated with experience and emotion, while Virgil, who will guide and protect him on his journey, is in blue. For Blake, the colour of spirituality and the imagination. Blake's figures have a fluid grace and complementarity in their gestures in this image, and it is noteworthy that Virgil appears Christ-like with outstretched arms. It is Virgil, or Blake's poetic genius, who will show Dante the path of enlightenment and salvation. In order to be reunited in heaven with Beatrice, Dante must witness all the terrors and punishments of hell and pass through the fires of purgatory. If one level of meaning in Dante's epic represents a late medieval narrative of the soul's search for salvation, then this would seem to parallel Blake's belief that mankind, fettered by the material world, must seek salvation through the imagination. This radiant watercolour clearly shows Blake's late style, with its richness in both technique and colour. The sonorous colour is built up with both fluidly handled washes and minute point of brush work. The variegated handling of the colour gives a richness to the greens and to the translucent dawn sky, and it's also seen in the touches of pure colour through the pelts of the animals. This is one of the completed watercolours in the series. It bears down in the lower right-hand corner Blake's signature and is very highly finished. Dante's text is remarkable for its evocation of the different atmospheres of the three spheres, heaven, hell, and purgatory, and Blake pays close attention to this in his watercolours. While Dante, running from the three beasts, is jewel-like and rich, the vestibule of hell, which I'm showing you here, conveys the murky underworld. Here Dante and Virgil have entered through the great gate, inscribed, "Abandon all hope, ye that enter here," and come to the shores of the river Acheron, which divides hell's vestibule from hell itself. Dante describes the starless air of hell and the air of endless black, and Blake conveys this gloom through sombre hues, browns, greys and blacks, which are heavily overworked, and I think he evokes a real sense of the underworld's claustrophobia. Here muster the souls of those who lived without blame and without praise, and who wait to be ferried across the Acheron by Charon, the demonic ferryman. Above them mourn the choir of angels who were neither faithful nor unfaithful to God, and who were cast out of heaven, but refused by hell. In the foreground, you can see the standard bearer that's described by Dante, who leads an interminable train of souls who are attacked by hornets. You can see them flying around above, wasps and loathsome worms, and there are worms wriggling under their feet. Dante described these figures as naked, but Blake has clothed them in rich ornaments to suggest worldly power and status. The varying stages of completion of the series give us an insight into Blake's process, which began with the sketching in of the composition with chalk and pencil. Watercolour washes were then laid down, and finally pen outlines were added to define the composition. This work, The Goddess of Fortune, shows one of the unfinished watercolours, as you can see. It depicts the fourth circle of hell, where the avaricious and the prodigal are punished. Their fate is to roll enormous weights against each other, using only their chests, and to eternally abuse each other for the habits of hoarding or squandering. Blake illustrates this part of the canto in the upper composition in sketchy pencil outlines. Below these sketched-in figures is the Goddess of Fortune, about whose role in the course of human history Dante questions Virgil. Virgil explained that fortune was ordained by God to determine men's material fortunes, yet Blake's own perspective on this is revealed in a fascinating pencil inscription that is still visible just above Fortune in the grey wash, just above her. And I'll read it to you. And Blake has written here, "The whole of a shithouse. The goddess Fortune is the devil's servant, ready to kiss anyone's ass." And Blake shows Fortune in a pit. The imaginative power Blake brings to the punishments described in Dante's text is seen in illustrations such as this great watercolour showing Capaneus. Here we are in the third ring of the seventh circle of hell, which has burning sand and an endless rain of flames, where the punishment for blasphemers was to lie for eternity on the burning ground. Capaneus was one of the 7 kings who besieged Thebes in Greek mythology and was killed by Zeus by a thunderbolt for hurling abuse at the god. He died with blasphemy on his lips and continued to defy Zeus even in hell, exemplifying for Dante stubborn pride. Blake shows him as proud and disdainful, unfettered by the thunderbolts and flames, which are so powerfully expressed through a highly worked technique. This includes sponging back and scratching out, and this can be seen in the thunderbolts, where it creates highlights, and also the sponging out on Capaneus's body, which creates this kind of powerful three-dimensionality of his figure. And you can see in this here Blake's appreciation and reverence even for Michelangelo's late nudes, an element that was evident in his late style. Blake was particularly fascinated by the punishments for thieves in the 7th pit of the 8th circle. And this punishment for the thieves was to be bitten by serpents and reduced to ashes, then brought back so that the process can be repeated. He dedicated 9 watercolours and 2 of his engravings to this subject, more works on this one subject than any other. And it has been suggested this reflected Blake's fascination with serpents and regular inclusion of them in his poetry. Not only was the serpent the instigator of the fall of mankind in the Bible, but it also appeared embodied as the character of Orc in Blake's mythology, where it symbolised sexual energy and revolution. One of the most extraordinary of these 9 watercolours is the one I'm showing you, the 6-footed serpent, attacking Angelo da Brunelleschi, the notorious Florentine thief. As Dante and Virgil watch on, a monstrous 6-footed serpent wraps its legs around Brunelleschi's stomach, arms and thighs, and that kind of detail is very closely depicted by Blake, and it clamps its jaws around his head, at which point the 2 bodies begin to fuse, as Dante describes, like hot wax. Blake's watercolour visualises this particular moment where the grotesque mutation of the 2 bodies as they begin to move is looked on at with horror by Dante and Virgil and 2 others. The last watercolour from Inferno that I'll talk about is one of the most celebrated and spectacular images of the entire series, Antaeus setting down Dante and Virgil in the last circle of hell. The giant Antaeus, who was invisible so long as he remained in contact with the earth, was asked for assistance by Virgil in reaching the 9th circle of hell. Dante uses several similes to convey the grandeur and largeness of Antaeus's gesture in placing Virgil and Dante across the chasm. He likens his stooping to the leaning tower of Garisenda when clouds are passing it, and his rising after placing them in the depths of hell to the mast of a heaving ship. Blake's close reading of the text informed his famous pictorial invention of Antaeus's contorted pose, through which his feet remain on the ground and his outstretched arm reflects the rigidity of a ship's mast. It is an inspired invention that brings Dante's visionary universe to life. When Dante and Virgil leave the underworld and come to purgatory, the darkness of hell is replaced in Dante's poem by a new expansiveness of space and light. As the pilgrims move up the hill of purgatory, the cycles of day and night become important and determine the mood in scenes animated by the sun, moon and stars. Blake's watercolours for Purgatorio reflect this new atmosphere. They become flooded with light and prismatic colour. We see this in this scene in Ante-Purgatory, described in Purgatorio Cantos 7 and 8. The lawn with kings and angels. This shows a lawn scooped out from the mountainside where the pilgrims see a group of negligent rulers. 2 angels appear above with blunted flaming swords to guard the rulers from a serpent, likened to that which tempted Eve. Blake follows the text in depicting the serpent among the flowers and grass to one side of the valley, turning its head at intervals to lick its back. The idyllic nature of the valley is conveyed by Dante's description of its sweet scents and richly coloured grass and flowers, which he likens to emeralds, cochineal, silver and gold. Although Blake shows the kings in a grove of trees rather than among flowers, this work is coloured with a rich array of verdant green, yellow and blue hues, touched with accents of red. In this beautiful work, Dante, at the moment of entering the fire, an even greater richness and iridescence of colour is evident. Dante and Virgil have now entered purgatory and have travelled through the 7 terraces of the mountain, arriving at the purifying fire through which Dante must pass to be purged of sin. We see Virgil already in the flames, Dante hesitating, and the Roman poet Statius behind him. Here the figures are graceful and the work is radiant. In Paradiso, Dante describes a realm beyond space or time, a celestial atmosphere that has no gravity or boundary. Here Dante is liberated from the material world and, guided now by Beatrice, completes his journey through heaven to the Empyrean, the abode of God and the beatified souls. Dante's paradise is made up of 9 concentric spheres, each of which is governed by a different planetary body and is brightly illuminated. In Canto 14, Dante rises to the 5th heavenly sphere, which is governed by Mars. Here he receives a vision of Christ as brilliant, glittering light shining in the heavens. In the text, the vision starts as one of the cross itself, upon which an image of Christ briefly flames. But in his watercolour, Blake omits the cross, showing instead Christ with his arms outstretched. Blake also omitted the figure of Beatrice and simply shows Dante kneeling at the very bottom of the image with his arms raised, adoring Christ. It is possible that Blake intended here to show Dante worshipping Christ without the intervention of the church. The text describes glimmering, moving lights along the cross and sweet harmonies of music that Blake's shimmering and wavering brushstrokes of translucent watercolour powerfully evoke. For Blake, as for Dante, paradise is about light. Blake conveys this in his watercolours, which introduce a new purity and translucence of colour. He uses the white of the paper to evoke the glittering atmosphere of Paradiso, and the colours have become rainbow-like without material substance. We see both of these qualities here in St. Peter and St. James with Dante and Beatrice, which is one of Blake's most intense and beautiful watercolours. The final illustration in the series is the Queen of Heaven in Glory, which Blake left unfinished. Dante is now in the Empyrean, where he sees a vision of heaven as a great white rose in which the souls of the redeemed reside. Here the Virgin Mary is seated as the Queen of Heaven, and for Blake, this was a symbol of the church of repressive dogma. And here you have to remember Blake's a Protestant, and so he's reacting against Dante's Catholicism. Blake's drawing includes details not in Dante's text, as well as annotations of his own. For example, Mary holds the mirror of nature and vanity, as well as a sceptre of worldly power. On either side of her are 2 sphinx-like creatures not mentioned in the text, and they're shown holding large tomes, the books of law, one which is labelled, and Blake's inscribed this, Bible chained round, and the other is inscribed thrones. Next to them are books labelled Aristotle and Homer. All Blake commentators agree that this implies a clear criticism of Mariolatry, the excessive devotion to the Virgin Mary, and criticism of the Catholic Church and of Dante's alleged sources of inspiration in the Greek classics instead of the Bible. It is one of the crucial drawings of the entire series and is vital to our understanding of Blake's view of the Divine Comedy. Yet although he clearly disagreed with aspects of Dante's theology, Blake ranked him among the very greatest poets. He told Samuel Palmer that he had approached Dante with fear and trembling, that is, with awe. And he told his visitor Henry Crabb Robinson that, despite his errors, Dante was inspired by the Holy Spirit. In other words, he too was a man of the imagination. And I'd like to hand over now to Dr. Paolo Baracchi, who's going to give us a reading from the Inferno. And thank you, Paolo.
Thank you, Cathy. Dante Alighieri, Divina Commedia, Inferno, canto terzo. Per me si va nella città dolente, per me si va nell'eterno dolore, per me si va tra la perduta gente. Giustizia mosse il mio alto fattore, fecemi la divina potestate, la somma sapienza e il primo amore. Dinanzi a me non fuor cose create, se non eterne, e io eterno duro. Lasciate ogni speranza, voi ch'intrate. Queste parole di colore oscuro vid'io scritte al sommo d'una porta, perch'io, maestro, il senso lor m'è duro, ed egli a me, come persona accorta. Qui si convien lasciare ogni sospetto, ogni viltà convien che qui sia morta. Noi siam venuti al loco, ov'io t'ho detto, che tu vedrai le genti dolorose ch'hanno perduto il ben dell'intelletto. E poi che la sua mano alla mia pose, con lieto volto, ond'io mi confortai, mi mise dentro alle segrete cose. Quivi sospiri, pianti e alti guai risonavan per l'aere senza stelle, perch'io al cominciarne lagrimai. Diverse lingue, orribili favelle, parole di dolore, accenti d'ira, voci alte e fioche e suon di man con elle facevano un tumulto, il qual s'aggira sempre in quell'aura senza tempo tinta, come l'arena quando turbo spira. E io, c'avea d'error la testa cinta, dissi, Maestro, che è quel chiodo? E che gente che par nel duol si vinta? Ed egli a me, questo misero modo tegnon l'anime triste di coloro che visser senza infamia e senza lodo. Mischiate sono a quel cattivo coro degli angeli che non fur ribelli, né fur fedeli a Dio, ma per sé fuoro. Caccian li ciel per non esser men belli, né lo profondo inferno li riceve, ch'alcuna gloria i rei avrebber delli. E io, maestro, che è tanto greve allor che lamentar li fa sì forte? Rispose, dicerolti molto breve. Questi non hanno speranza di morte e la lor cieca vita è tanto bassa che invidiosi son d'ogni altra sorte. Fama di loro il mondo esser non lassa, misericordia e giustizia li sdegna. Non ragioniam di lor, ma guarda e passa. E io che riguardai, vidi un'ansegna che girando correva, tanto ratta che d'ogni posa mi parea indegna. E dentro le venia sì lunga tratta di gente chi non avrei creduto che morte tanta n'avesse disfatta. Poscia ch'io vebbi alcun riconosciuto, vidi e conobbi l'ombra di colui che fece per viltade il gran rifiuto. Incontanente intesi e certo fui che questa era la setta di cattivi, a Dio spiacenti e a nemici sui. Questi sciaurati, che mai non fur vivi, erano ignudi e stimolati molto da mosconi e da vespe che eran ivi. Elle rigavan lor di sangue il volto, che mischiato di lagrime a lor piedi da fastidiosi vermi era ricolto. E poi che a riguardar oltre mi diedi, vidi genti alla riva d'un gran fiume, perch'io dissi, Maestro, or mi concedi chi sappia quali sono e qual costume le fa di trapassar parersi pronte, com'io discerno per lo fioco lume. Ed egli a me, le cose ti fier conte quando noi fermerem li nostri passi sulla trista riviera d'Acheronte. Allor, con gli occhi vergognosi e bassi, temendo nol mio dir li fosse grave, infino al fium del parlar mi trassi. Ed ecco verso noi venir per nave un vecchio, bianco per antico pelo, gridando, guai a voi, anime brave, non isperate mai veder lo cielo, i vegno per menarvi all'altra riva, nelle tenebre eterne, in caldo e in gelo. E tu, che sei costì, anima viva, partiti da codesti che son morti. Ma poi che vide ch'io non mi partiva, disse, per altra via, per altri porti verrai a piaggia, non qui per passare, più lieve legno convien che ti porti. E il duca lui, Caron, non ti crucciare, vuolsi così colà dove si puote ciò che si vuole, e più non dimandare. Vinci fuor quete le lanose gote al nocchier della livida palude, che intorno agli occhi avea di fiamme rote. Ma quell'anime ch'eran lasse e nude, cangiar colore e dibattero i denti, tanto che inteser le parole crude. Bestemmiavano Dio e lor parenti, l'umana spezie, il loco, il tempo e il seme di lor semenza e di lor nascimenti. Poi si ritrasser tutte quante insieme, forte piangendo, alla riva malvagia che attende ciascun uom che Dio non teme. Caron dimonio, con occhi di bragia, loro accennando tutte le raccoglie, batte col remo qualunque s'adagia. Come d'autunno si levan le foglie, l'una appresso dell'altra, finché il ramo vede la terra tutte le sue spoglie, similemente il mal seme d'Adamo gittansi di quel lito ad una, per cenni come augel per suo richiamo. Così sen vanno su per l'onda bruna, e avanti che sien di là discese, anche di qua nuova schiera s'auna. Figliuol mio, disse il maestro cortese, quelli che muoion nell'ira di Dio, tutti convegnon qui d'ogni paese, e pronti sono a trapassar l'orio che la divina giustizia li sprona, sì che la tema si volve in disio. Quinci non passa mai anima buona, e però se Caron di te si lagna, ben puoi sapere omai che il suo dir suona. Finito questo, la buia campagna tremò sì forte che dello spavento la mente di sudore ancor mi bagna. La terra lagrimosa diede vento che balenò una luce vermiglia, la qual mi vinse ciascun sentimento, e caddi come l'uom cui sonno piglia. Grazie, thank you. It is now my pleasure to pass to Dr. Dominic Barbaro, President of Società Dante Alighieri, Melbourne.
Thank you, Paolo, for the wonderful way that you have just read that beautiful canto. I too wish to acknowledge the past and present custodians of the land we stand on today. And I'm also very proud to acknowledge that Dante Ligeri Melbourne, founded in 1896, which was only a few years after the unification of Italy in 1865, was the first Dante branch outside of Italy in an English-speaking nation, and presumably one of the oldest Italian associations in Australia. Therefore, it behoves upon me to recall that the society was created with much excitement and passion for the Italian language and culture by a group of very distinguished personalities, such as the then Consul General of Italy, the Prince of Abruzzi during his visit on board the warship Cristoforo Colombo, the editor of the Argus newspaper, and the Governor, Lord Brassey, and other dignitaries. And to make it more complete and significant, its first president was James Smith, an Anglo-Saxon, not an Italian, which was a good sign for the future evolution of the desired targets and needs of the society within the artistic and cultural debates and presentations in the future. And this takes me to the 5th of September 2020 in the city of Ravenna in Italy. His Excellency, the Honourable Sergio Mattarella, President of the Italian Republic, launched the 700th anniversary of the death of Dante Alighieri with concerts, musical, intellectual and cultural activities which were followed and continued around the world for a period of 12 months to honour our sommo poeta Dante, who inspired so many writers and artists to create their own interpretation of the Divina Commedia journey into our contemporaneous world. When the Dante Ligeri Society of Australia together decided to participate in unison under the appropriate umbrella of Under the Southern Cross, we in Melbourne immediately felt that we were fortunate to have a treasure residing within the National Gallery of Victoria, which would make us proud to present as our contribution to Dante's celebrations. And of course, I'm referring to the famous watercolour illustrations of the Divina Commedia by the great William Blake. Today, we have been very fortunate to have been able to passionately immerse ourselves in William Blake's illustrations of the Divina Commedia through the expert interpretation of Miss Cathy Leahy, a great senior curator at the National Gallery. Thank you, Cathy, for your wonderful presentation of two great geniuses who, through the immortal work, have demonstrated that art tells a living story, which, although time and time again, albeit in different forms, inspires people, and when deeply considered and studied, these art forms become relevant in today's world. I've been fascinated by the description of the presented watercolours in interpreting Dante's story and in his writings. And I feel so much better in my concept of the Divina Commedia now that I've been able to appreciate your talents in describing to us what we were expecting from such a person at the National Gallery. Thank you, Paolo Baracchi, for reading, the Secretary of the Dante Alighieri Melbourne, for bringing music to our ears with Florentine Dantesco sound through the Canto 3 of the Inferno. We have deliberately chosen you for this reading in order to give it a more natural rendition, as a common term used these days. You have certainly succeeded. You are our Italo-Australian Roberto Benigni. Thank you, Mary Marcuccio, for all your immense effort in coordinating this tremendously significant event. Thank you, Weston Barbaro, Senior Manager in the Corporate Administrative Team at the National Gallery, for putting us along this diletta via that led us to the National Gallery today. Thank you, National Gallery Director, Dr. Tony Elwood, for having given us the opportunity to make our significant contribution to Under the Southern Cross celebrations during the 700th anniversary of the death of Dante Ligeri. Mille grazie to our audience, in the hope that despite our inability to meet in person for reasons beyond our control, for your participation and appreciation of the Divina Commedia through the eyes of the great William Blake. Thank you, everyone. Take care.